Hi, I'm Paul Vacheski, NebraskaLandlord.com. Welcome to another educational video. Today we're going to be talking about buying a rental property with an existing tenant. The last 6-7 weeks I seem, for whatever reason, I've been getting quite a few emails and telephone calls and texts about what are my recommendations when buying a home with an existing tenant to kind of protect yourself. And I've been through this a couple of times, several times actually, and I've helped a lot of investors throughout the years navigate this. And I will tell you this, be very careful when you're buying a home with an existing tenant, because there's a good chance that you may be inheriting another landlord's headache and problem. So here are some things that we can do to minimize or mitigate some of those risks. First of all, understand that when you're buying a home with an existing tenant, there's a rental agreement already in place, whether it's an actual lease agreement with a fixed expiration date, maybe they're 6 months into a 1-year lease, or they're month to month and it falls under the landlord tenant statute, or maybe there is an actual lease that's month to month as well. You have to know the details of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But understand that when you close on that property, you have to abide by the terms of that existing lease agreement. You can't change it. All right, so if it's a month to month, then you can, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing is, we don't want to assume somebody else's problem. So maybe they have a problem tenant. I highly encourage that if the tenant is on a month-to-month rental agreement or lease agreement, that you conduct a tenant selection screening like you would for a brand new tenant. All right, so if that tenant wants to stay there, then you have to let them know that, hey, that's fine, but you're going to have to go through my tenant selection policy. You're going to have to fill out my application, and you may or may not be selected based on my qualification, because your qualification may be different than the existing landlord's. We're also going to protect ourselves against a dishonest owner. I'll never forget, I purchased a rental property one time, and the landlord said that the security deposit was $250. And I didn't verify that, and I got the $250 at closing. However, when the existing tenant left, I found out that it was actually $500. I had to pay the $250 additional security deposit, and then decided whether I was going to go after the tenant or the previous owner for being dishonest. So, and the other thing is, as I talked previously, we have to find out a month-to-month versus fixed expiration on the lease or rental agreement, because if, for example, on the tenant selection here, if they're on a month-to-month, then you can do a tenant screening, all right? So you can run them through your tenant selection policy. If they are on a fixed expiration, maybe they're 6 months into that year lease, you can't do anything. So when you buy that house and you close on it, that lease is in effect until the remaining for the remaining amount of the lease agreement. So here are some things you can do on the purchase agreement. So you have the existing tenant that's there, you looked at the property, you like it, and you're going to write an offer. A couple of things you might think about. One of the things that I always did is run them through the existing my tenant selection policy if they're on month to month. If they passed, great. If not, then one of the contingencies that I had in the purchase agreement is that before we close, I would have a closing date in the contract, but it would also be contingent upon the legal right of possession belonging to me at closing, meaning that the existing landlord must get rid of the current tenant. That means they would serve notice, given the 30-day notice, and they have to be moved out completely, and all personal property and everything taken care of before we close. That's one of the things that I always did. Maybe something you consider. Once again, existing tenants, if they're on month-to-month, run them through your application process. I highly recommend that if you're not using tenant data services, tenantdata.com for your background check, your criminal background check, prior landlord check, and so forth. You need to. They're a Nebraska-based company, and they're probably the best in Nebraska. Purchase agreement contingency number 2 is, this is kind of a cool one, particularly if it's a vacant property. So let's say you have a 30 to 45 day closing, right, and it's a vacant property. Use that vacancy time, or that time between the contract and closing, to find your tenant. So write a contingency in the purchase agreement that gives you, the buyer, permission to show the property to prospective, show and market, or market and show the property to prospective tenants. So during that downtime, I call it, when all the other stuff is going on, you know, getting surveys or, you know, title searches and all that, that you're actually actively showing the property to prospective tenants. Now, if you find a tenant and you approve them, make sure that the tenant understands that, one, they can't move in until you close on it, and number two, if you have them sign a lease agreement, that lease agreement is contingent upon the successful closing of the property. So something to think about, but this is a great way to, day one, as soon as you close on Friday morning, Friday afternoon, you got a rent check in hand and they are your tenant's moving in, so you have no downtime. This is an effective tool, but it's usually only good for vacant properties. And then the other one is notification of new ownership. This has to be done prior to closing. If the current landlord says absolutely not, you're not to be involved with them or talk to them or reach out to them or communicate with them prior to closing, then you probably shouldn't buy the property. That means they're hiding something. And I'm real confident on that. At some point in the process before closing, there has to be a touch made to the existing tenant, because number one, we want to run them through a screening process, and number two is there are things that we want to verify. I call it trust but verify. All right, trust but verify. Things that we're going to verify during a due diligence period. And one of the things that another purchase agreement contingency that you should write into the contract is a 10 to 30 day due diligence period that allows you as the buyer to verify things that you need. Now, if it's a single family home, 10 days is usually enough time to do it. If you're buying a multi-unit, some of the smaller multi-units, maybe a 12-unit apartment building or something, you may need up to 30 days. But that number is certainly negotiable. But what we're doing during this due diligence period is you want to verify that who owns the personal property. There's a stove, a refrigerator, there's a washer and dryer. Do not assume that the landlord is telling you the truth or the existing owner is telling you the truth. We want verification. I've seen this over and over where it's advertised with a washer and dryer only to find out the washer and dryer belongs to the tenant. One of the things that I have, and I'm going to make available in the comments below and also on in the forms menu on the NebraskaLandlord.com blog, is a verification of new ownership. It's going to do two things. You as the buyer, or the new future or the future landlord, you're going to send this to the tenant in a self-addressed stamped envelope, so they will reply saying, "Hi, I'm buying the property. Here's the estimated closing date. I need you to verify some items. The property has a stove, refrigerator, washer, dryer. Do you own any of them?" The landlord says he or she owns X, Y, and Z, and you own X, Y, and Z. Can you verify this? And number two is, currently, according to the lease that I've read through, and I'll talk about more about that in a minute, your current rent every month is $700, and you gave the current landlord a security deposit in the amount of $700 and a $100 pet deposit or something. We are verifying the personal property ownership, who owns it, and their current amount of rent and security deposit. Had I done this when I purchased the property, I would have found out real quick that it was a $500 security deposit and not $250, and I could have then dealt with it before closing. All right, so ownership of personal property. Existing tenant files, we need to have a contingency during this due diligence period that says that I want to review any and all existing tenant files for that property. So if it's a single family house, there's only going to be one tenant. We want to get a copy of the lease agreement and review it. One thing we're looking for in the lease agreement is how much are the rents, the security deposits, and I'm also looking for, is it fixed expiration date, like a one-year lease or a month-to-month? I'm also looking for if there's any illegal provisions in the lease agreement. I had one time, paragraph number 1 said no Mexicans. That is a serious fair housing violation, and if I would have closed on the property, this was a fixed expiration lease, not only is the previous landlord, it's substantial fair housing risk, but at closing now, it's mine as well, okay? So we want to make sure that there are no illegal provisions in the lease agreement, and if they are, we have to deal with that at the time. We want to make sure that there's rental history and those kind of things. So we want to review all all existing tenant files. We want the past 12 months of utility bills. So if you're buying a community, maybe a 12-unit apartment building, and you pay the water and the sewer, then I want the last 12 months to verify that the information that the current owner gave me is accurate, so I know my actual cost. I want copies of any work orders and current contracts. For example, lawn and snow removal. I want a copy of that. How much, when does it end and how much am I being charged? For multi-units, if you have laundry services, could be a 10-year contract with only a 30-day window at the end of that 10 years to cancel it. So we want to make sure that we are reviewing those. We're verifying security deposits and rent amounts. And then the last thing is property files. But prior to closing, or at closing, we need to make sure that we get abstract surveys and any lead-based paint documents that are there, those type of things. So that's pretty much it for this particular video. I'm sure I've missed a few things. If I have, make sure that in the comments below that you ask questions, or if I missed something, you include that in the comments so the other readers and the other viewers can see it as well. So please do comment. I love comments. I love questions. I will answer them, so I'm plugging the comment part. Other than that, until next time, I'm Paul Vacheski. Thanks for watching and happy landlording.